AVAIYA has changed my life.
AVAIYA has made me the woman I am today.
AVAIYA is my home.
AVAIYA is personal freedom.
AVAIYA is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about AVAIYA.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, AVAIYA, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at AVAIYA is what the world needs.
Hello, AVAIYA family. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner Ike Allen and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of AVAIYA University. AVAIYA is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for joining us. Our fellow teacher, Julie Brown Yao, is with us today to talk about the nature of developmental trauma. Julie is an author, a speaker, and has a 33-year background in psychological, somatic, and spiritual traditions, which provides a unique depth of knowledge and direct experience. She specializes in the resolution of developmental trauma, inherited and acute trauma. Welcome to AVAIYA, Julie.
Thank you for having me, Andy. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I would love it if we just dive right into developmental trauma, since that is one of your specialties. So can you talk about what developmental trauma is and who is susceptible to it?
Well, let's begin with who's susceptible to it. I believe all children are susceptible to developmental trauma. And I would even go so far as to say it's really a natural phenomena. So we will all experience developmental trauma sometime in our childhood. And this can be anytime from in utero up to about 11 years of life. So even those of us who have this constancy or consistency of parental love and care are still susceptible to developmental trauma. So let me tell you why that can be. So developmental trauma, really, to speak about it simply, sort of a rather broad view, is to say it comes about when there is lack of attunement from the caregiver to the child, right, or the caregiver to the baby. So when we come into the world, or even in utero, we are completely dependent upon our caregivers, right? We have needs that have to be met by others to allow us to feel safe in our body, safe in the world, and safe in relationship. And so if there's lack of attunement from the caregivers or the parents or even the medical community, in a birthing situation, then the infant or the child can feel some form of a threat. And that threat in the body can feel too much for a child. And this can be the beginning of developmental trauma, because we disconnect from the body or the emotion or the threat or the fear, which leaves that unresolved in our body or our body brain. When I say body, I'm including nervous system and brain. Mm-hmm. And if that's not recognized by the caregivers, right, then it remains inside of us. And we learn to adapt to a world that isn't attuning to us in a way that we need to feel safe. And we adapt to try and get what we need in one way or another. So we can unpack that a little bit if you like, but that's really, the origins of developmental trauma, mm-hmm. Lack or inadequate caregiving.
Yeah. And so I'm curious, you talked about, how we can adapt to this lack of care, basically. What are some of the ways that we adapt? What are some of the, coping mechanisms we develop and in order to survive those scenarios?
Yeah, well, there's many, and thank goodness we have them, because as you said, it does allow us to survive. So let's take an infant. An infant can learn that it's futile to cry out, right? And so will silence itself and not cry, because it learns nobody comes if I cry. Mm-hmm. And I'll speak a little bit more to that in a few moments. But we can also feel that, our voice or our protests are not heard, and in fact can cause even more disconnection than that might already be happening with our caregivers. So we learn to not protest, which shuts down our capacity of healthy aggression, which is really important to have, right? It allows people around us to know something's not going on or not feeling safe for us. We can learn to tend to other people instead of allowing ourselves to be tended to, because for some reason we perceived that wasn't going to work for ourselves as a child, right? So we adapt to being the caregiver of others, or we learn that, you know, the world isn't a place where we can trust. So we stop trusting and feel like we can only trust ourselves. So there's many adaptations that we can take on, and they help us in childhood, but in adulthood, these adaptations are really getting in the way of our self-expression, our capacity for connection, our open-heartedness, our relationships, you know, our connection to ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that's probably why a lot of us are here, right? Figuring out how to work through those. And I'm curious, in your work, you talk about, right, developmental trauma, which we've just been talking about, and then something called shock trauma. Can you share about, like, what, I know these are different things and yet they can be intertwined. Can you share a little bit about how they're different and yet how they can be intertwined?
Yeah, absolutely. But then I give you an example. A gentleman that I was just working with, actually, he came to see me because of this terrible anxiety that he's carrying in his body, and this ongoing thought process of how he's not good enough. And, you know, it's really, and he's in his 50s and he's highly successful. Nobody would know in his internal world he's feeling so dreadful about himself. So in our work together, what we uncovered was a shock trauma when he was about 4 or 5 years old. And the shock trauma was he put a knife, like a metal knife, into this electrical fire that was on the wall and got this horrible electric shock, which burned his hand, right? So that was a shock trauma, this impact that hurt him, that terrified him, that was too much for his system, couldn't quite assimilate it. Now, there's different types of shock traumas, but that just gives you an idea of a shock trauma, an impact that's too much, terrifies us, kind of bowls us over in some way. Now, his parents heard him and came into the room where he was. Now, the parents, in a really loving way, could have gone over to him, held him, helped him calm his system, you know, tended to the burn on his hand, told him he was going to be okay. And then maybe that shock that he had would not have embedded in his system as a trauma. However, the parents came in the room, saw what he'd done, and actually ridiculed him and then told him off. You know, like, how stupid can you be? I can't believe you did that. You deserve the pain. We've told you not to do this. Or the boy just went into a deeper state of shock. So we have the shock trauma that embedded in his system. And then a developmental trauma is the parents not attuning to what he needed, which was really their acknowledgement of this shock that he'd gone through. You know, he was 4 or 5 years old. He was still just experimenting, playing, not realizing what was going to happen. But the ridicule of his parents went into him, and he realized, oh yeah, I'm stupid. I'm never going to be good enough. I always do something wrong, right? And that imprints inside of him, and he carries that forward. So he creates this split inside of himself, right? Of not being good enough, always going to do things wrong. And that shows up later in life as symptoms of anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great example. I'm glad you shared that, because I'm sure a lot of people have had some kind of experience like that where perhaps, they weren't nurtured in the way they should have been, needed to be after having done something that kids do, right? That we get into stuff, right? Yeah.
And can create a tremendous amount of shame. Mm-hmm. So the symptoms of just that shock trauma could, of course, have caused a lot of anxiety in him if that hadn't been tended to. But the developmental trauma can also create a lot of symptoms of anxiety. So the symptoms of a shock or acute trauma can look very similar to developmental trauma, but they really do need to be addressed differently.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And I know that you also talk about developmental trauma being about disconnection. Can you talk a little bit about why that is?
Yeah. So developmental trauma, we are disconnecting from what feels too much for us to be able to bear as an infant or a child. Right? So if there's emotions that are coming up that are feeling too strong, like anger or rage can be really frightening for an infant or a child. They're very tumultuous emotions. And so we have these mechanisms defense mechanisms inside of us that allow us to disconnect from those emotions. Now, unfortunately, the emotions don't disappear. They embed down into our body. They can really go into our organs, into our joints, but they don't disappear. These emotions stay inside of us. We just push them down or disconnect from them. Very, very early trauma, we can disconnect from our body. So if we are experiencing some kind of distress because our needs are not being met, that distress in our body will trigger the capacity to be able to disconnect from the body. And there's lifelong ramifications of that. I've worked with people in their 70s who've been disconnected from their body their whole life, because of very, very early trauma. If our needs are not being met, like we have these needs to be held, to be nourished, to be attuned to be mirrored, to be delighted in, to be seen, to be heard. If they're not being met, right, it's really frightening for a child. Some of those needs not being met can actually feel like a life threat. And so it seems easier for us to close those needs down and disconnect from our needs than to actually have them and have them not being met. Right. And so we don't always remember, in fact, more often than not, we don't remember that we've closed down our needs or disconnected from our body or disconnected from our emotions. And we grow up feeling this is just the way life is. But we get a tremendous amount of symptoms, or challenges in our relationships or in our work environment. And so it takes a little bit of looking inward and discovery to connect that back to developmental trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm curious too, for people who don't remember having experienced any trauma, or they think that they've had a pretty good childhood, they don't remember any forms of abuse, whether that's, physical, sexual, emotional, what have you. How would they know if their challenges they're faced with right now as an adult are related to some kind of developmental trauma that they just don't remember?
Yeah, it's a great question. Often people don't know. And this is why this program that you're putting out and all the information today that's coming out about developmental trauma, relational trauma, childhood trauma is so important, because it allows people to look into that a little bit more. I really feel that a lot of our difficulties in adulthood can be traced back to our developing years. So we have all of these limitations in our life, in how we express ourselves, in our capacity to feel, or our capacity to relate, to express our needs. We don't always understand where that comes from. Often because the first 3 years of life, we tend to not have a lot of memory anyway, right? Or people have this idea that trauma is big events, car accidents, surgeries, death of a parent. And of course, that is very traumatic. But there's other traumas that we don't remember or don't view as trauma that can really distort how we view the world and how what our relationship is to ourselves. So really, knowledge, understanding what developmental trauma is the first thing. The understanding and the knowledge about it isn't necessarily going to heal us. We need to go inside and work, usually with another, to dismantle these very, very early patterns that are put in place and begin to shift out of these adaptations that we've taken on as who we are, and gently begin to disidentify them, to really come back to our self, or our core self, that gets either split off or hidden away or pushed down when we're a child in response to an environment that's not giving us the safety and the comfort and the love that we need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let's talk a little bit more about that, right? Like, if for people who didn't get their needs met, right? And this might be that it may not have been some big T trauma. Maybe it was something more subtle or something that you wouldn't consider a trauma. But if you don't get your needs met, maybe you're not validated, or, some kind of emotional, right, ignoring from parents, that kind of stuff. What may happen when those needs are not met?
again, all kinds of adaptations can occur. Let me speak about an infant, because I'm so passionate about infants and having their needs being met, because they are so completely dependent. And there's still this cultural, I think, misperception of what really healthy caregiving is for infants right now. There's this idea of sleep training, or this idea that if you leave your babies alone for a few nights to cry it out, they'll eventually sleep through the night, and then mom and dad can get a good night's sleep. Now, that's great for mom and dad, and let's be honest, a lot of the time now, both parents do need to be able to have to work, right, to look after their children. But what's happening to the child that's been left alone to cry it out? It goes into greater and greater cycles of distress as it's crying for its caregivers to come and hold it and pick it up and soothe it. Because that first year of life, an infant doesn't have the capacity yet to self-soothe. That's actually being cultivated when it's been held and soothed by a caregiver or a parent. So the child learns that if I cry, I go into higher and higher states of arousal and discomfort in my body, and it actually feels really threatening. And that level of threat in a child's body will cause this disconnection from its body, right? And from its capacity to protest. And so will grow up having no connection to the body, and maybe they're going to live in the mind, right? And can actually have a very successful life. I've worked with a number of really successful people who look, amazing in the world from the outside, but inside are in this incredible sense of disconnection. And so not only have they disconnected from their body, but they've disconnected from their self, right? So this part of our essential self or essence or core of our being, we move away from it. It goes into hiding, if you will, because we've learned that it's just too dangerous or it's not safe to be here. That's in very early trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm curious, right? You mentioned a little while ago, like relational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that a lot of people watching or listening right now might have issues, right? Having healthy relationships because of relational trauma. Are there any insights you can share to that? Like if people struggled with attachment and all sorts of different things with parents, and now they're really struggling to connect in, let's say, romantic partnerships or friendships. Any suggestions for them?
Yeah, well, it's hard to give a suggestion without hearing exactly what's going on, but we really want to hold in mind or in our hearts that whatever was happening in relationship with our caregivers when we were younger is really shaping how we're going to relate, usually in our intimate relationships when we're older. So if we're disconnected from ourselves and have had these layers of heartache, if you will, our heart is closing to different degrees. We're usually not aware of that as we grow older and are in relationships, right? And so our lens of perception about other and ourself is always going to be colored, right, in some way based on our past. And so the work is really to look inside and maybe discover or see, what is my perception of the other? Is that really true, or am I perceiving and projecting what my past was like, or how I perceive myself? So I was just working with a couple where the husband got very, very angry at his wife when she didn't tend to his needs, right? And he would go into this great anger. And his story was, every time I'm going to leave her, it's hopeless, I'm going to find somebody else, I'll find somebody else, they'll tend to my needs and I'll live happily ever after, right? So what happened eventually for them was he was able to realize it wasn't his wife not meeting his needs that was creating such anger. It was the anger that was carried in his body that he wasn't able to express as a child about his needs not being expressed then when his life depended on it. Okay? So eventually he realizes, oh, my life is not dependent upon my wife meeting my needs or not. right? I have these needs. I can express them. If they don't get met, maybe it's not great, but I'm not going to die. And for him, that was huge, right? And when he realized that perception of anger was based on the past, that he was still right here in the present with him, that his life was not in danger, and he could feel the need underneath that anger, right? He no longer went into these explosive, I'm going to leave you, you don't, he was able to calm down, stay present, connect with her. She was able to connect with him more, So it's really looking at what's happening and saying, is this really about this relationship? Or could this be something that I'm carrying inside of me based on my childhood?
Right. Yeah. Like, I think what you're talking about is projection, right? When we project. Yeah. It's so interesting because it can be, in my experience, so convincing. You can really convince yourself of, oh, this is definitely about this current right relationship.
Absolutely. And it might be that his wife wasn't meeting his needs, or our partner is whatever's happening. That might be so, but our reactivity might be based on the past and not the current relationship that we're in. And so it's always worth exploring that.
Yeah. I'm curious too, in reading a little bit about your work, I know you also talk about inherited trauma. What is that? How can that influence us in our ability to have a happy life?
Yeah. Well, there's different ways of looking at inherited trauma. So we know there's intergenerational trauma, where trauma from our grandparents and our parents can be passed down through epigenetics. But there's also the inherited trauma that we can pick up in utero or in these first few years of life that's maybe not spoken about so much. So let's say there's a 2-year-old, they're running around playing, and they look at mom, and mom looks at them, and mom's dissociated because of her own trauma. And she looks at the 2-year-old, and she just has this dull, sort of dissociated look in her face. She's not fully present. When the 2-year-old looks at her from this 2-year-old's expansive, loving, playful state, the child will contract, because whatever the parent is transmitting to her through her eyes, maybe unbeknownst to the mother, right? The child takes on something like, oh, it's not okay to be expansive and playful because it somehow upsets mom, right? Or maybe mom was angry about something unrelated to the child, and will look at the child with angry eyes. The child will feel like they've done something to cause that anger in the mom, and shut themselves down, or feel shame, or something like that. So parents can transmit their states of being into the child unbeknownst to them. And the child, of course, doesn't realize, oh, it's not what I'm doing, or it's not who I am that's creating this upset in the environment or in my parents. The child tends to blame themselves, right? And it's sort of a choiceless choice. We can't look at our parents when we're very young and say, gosh, what's going on with mom and dad, right? No, it's usually, we have to see mom and dad in this wonderful light. They have to be these loving people, because they're the world. We have to have hope in the world. So we take on, well, there must be something wrong with me. Right. How can I change me? How can I be different so they won't be angry, or they will become more present, or they will see me? What can I do? So that's another way of this transmission of a parent's trauma moving into the child in a more subtle way.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, because I think, at least in my experience, right, in becoming an adult, there are things that I understand better about my parents, and like, oh, right, they were just, right, maybe as confused as I currently am sometimes, right? Or oh, okay, so I haven't worked through all my stuff, so I guess they probably hadn't worked through all their stuff either, and all the it's interesting to kind of get that experience as we get older. And obviously with, super horrific childhood trauma, I'm sure it is extremely hard to understand certain things that parents do. And I can't even imagine it, but yeah, it's just, I think for more of like the small T kinds of things, I'm like, wow, like, oh.
But actually what I see in people that are working with their developmental trauma, whether it's what you're calling big traumas or little traumas, they all have a very severe impact, in our body and nervous system and who we are in the world. But in the healing process, there's a natural outcome of compassion. Because in the healing process, we're opening our own hearts, we're reconnecting back to ourselves, this inner confidence, this inner strength, who we are and who we can be as an adult. And we have compassion for what we went through as a child. But that compassion begins to spread out. And we have this natural compassion then for our parents. So we never want to bypass, the natural opening of compassion with an understanding of, well, I'll hear some people say, my parents were really, really terrible, but I get it because their parents were terrible, or they were brought up in a war or a revolution, so I get what they did to me and it's kind of okay. And I said, well, it's okay to understand that, but not if you're bypassing the pain and the anger and the rage and the sadness and the heartbreak. No, we never blame our parents for what happened. That doesn't do any good, but we want to own or come and feel and resolve what's inside of us. And as we do so, there's usually a natural compassion that goes along with the understanding of what occurred. It might never be okay, but that compassion really breaks this cycle of hatred and anger and blame and can bond us back to parents, which is really important, even if they weren't the most loving, parents or caregivers that we needed them to be.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that's a great example of how healing that can be. I'd love it if you'd share a little bit about your gift you have for everyone, since we're running low on time. I know there's a button below that links over to your site. So what do you have for us?
Yeah, wonderful. So people go follow that link. There's a couple of meditations on there. One is about loving this inner child. Well, not inner child, but connecting to our consciousness, younger consciousness, right? And helping to self-regulate and self-soothe. So I think there's 4 different exercises on there. People can look through them, listen to them, and practice them, see what might work for them. And again, self-regulation isn't really what's going to heal, but it helps us in the healing process move towards being able to find these patterns that we can begin to dismantle.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for that. And are there any last insights you want to talk about before we wrap up?
Well, just that, I always like to say that probably everybody has some degree of developmental trauma, and it's really worth, taking a look inside and seeing what that might be, because it's not only about healing ourselves, it's about having the understanding of what that actually means and preventing it, from preventing it from being passed on to our loved ones or our children, talking about it a little bit more, sharing what we understand about it a little bit more, bringing it more out into the open. That trauma is a normal part of life. Developmental trauma is a normal part of life. The more we address it, talk about it, speak about it, heal it, the more open-hearted and connected we're going to be, not only to ourselves, which allows us to feel so much more alive and present, but it's going to allow us to feel so much more connected to others in the world around us. I think we really need that right now.
Yes, we do. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those insights, Julie, and thanks so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy. Take care.
And thank you, AVAIYA students watching or listening right now, for showing up for yourself on this journey. And we will see you again very soon. Take care. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this latest class with Julie Brown Yao. She talked with us today about the nature of developmental trauma. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope you got a lot out of it and really just getting a better understanding of what developmental trauma is and how, no matter how big or small the trauma was, how this is a part of everyone's life to some extent, right? We all have had some level of developmental trauma in our life. And then how did we adapt to it? How did we cope with it? And how did those adaptations and coping mechanisms then turn into, right, the personality traits that we have today? Maybe things like people pleasing or walking on eggshells around people or not having a lot of confidence, or maybe you're someone who shuts down a lot and doesn't let people in, and you have trouble with vulnerability. So there's so many different things we can think of as it relates to developmental trauma and how this can lead to these adaptations later in life, and how that can influence any number of things in our life, our health, our ability to have a great career, follow our passions, relationships, you name it. So hope that you got a lot out of this conversation today, and we will see you again real soon. Take care.
AVAIYA has changed my life.
AVAIYA has made me the woman I am today.
AVAIYA is my home.
AVAIYA is personal freedom.
AVAIYA is the reason my life continuously improves.
Let everyone in your life know about AVAIYA.
Everyone needs to know about this amazing company.
Thank you, AVAIYA, for appearing in my inbox.
What Ike Allen and Andy Anderson have created at AVAIYA